This is Green Tide Rising, a podcast following Latin America's green wave abortion rights movement.
And how it's unveiling a blueprint for global reproductive freedom.
I'm Monica Morales Garcia.
And I'm Asha Dyer. In the last episode, we explored the origins of the Green Wave movement in Argentina, which led the country to become the first in Latin America to formally legalize abortion. But in this episode, we are headed to El Salvador, where abortion is illegal under any and all circumstances. This is a country that is considered one of the most dangerous places in the world for women, according to the United Nations. And how did they get here? Well, keep listening to hear the eye-opening history, how the United States played a leading role in this, and how everyday women like Teodora Vasquez are shouldering the brutal burden of the Salvadoran regime. And a quick trigger warning before we begin. We do mention police violence, near-fatal pregnancy loss, and detailed descriptions of blood. Please take care while listening.
On Friday, July 13th, 2007, I was about 9 months pregnant.
It was a Friday the 13th, July 2007. During this time of the year, it's wet season in El Salvador. So it rains in bursts throughout the day, while keeping a high of 80 degrees. And on that Friday, it was Teodora Vasquez's last day at work. She was 24 and working at a college coffee shop in the capital of El Salvador, San Salvador. After her shift, she was going to go to her parents' house, over 3 hours away. And there, she was going to wait to give birth to her baby girl.
Well, I said, well, I'm going to finish now, and it was Friday, so I said, well, it's Friday, and tomorrow is Saturday. I'm going to finish this day of work, and tomorrow I'll go. It was what we decided. I'm going to my mom's, and there I'm going to wait for my baby. That was the plan, my plan.
That was her plan. Teodora had 15 days before her due date, and she tried to work right up until she couldn't anymore. During the school year, Teodora lived at the college and would send most of her money back to her parents and her 3-year-old toddler. Her partner was doing the same. The plan was to all get together on Saturday.
And I was so happy to give birth to my baby because I really wanted to meet her, to be with her and to spend time together.
She was so excited. But she says the worst parts of being pregnant is how much time you spend imagining what your life is going to be like after the baby comes.
I think that one of the greatest illusions there is the ability to see. Well, you're waiting for over 9 months and suddenly knowing that the day has arrived to meet her. Well, I was really very excited.
She was looking forward to this new chapter in her life, building her little family. But that Friday at work, she wasn't feeling well.
And that day, during work, I spoke with the school director, I spoke with the teacher. I told her that I didn't feel well and that I was going to go to the hospital.
Her pain started around 5 o'clock. She told her co-workers, the director of the school, and a professor that she wasn't feeling well and wanted to go to the hospital after her shift. But by 7 p.m., many of her colleagues had left work early.
They all got into their cars and left. They left me there in pain.
She was alone. She remembers, one by one, people got into their cars and drove off. And the pain was only getting worse, so she called an ambulance.
They just told me, oh, the ambulance is coming, seeing the condition I was in.
No one stayed back with her. She still can't forget the woman who told her, don't worry, an ambulance will be on its way, and then left.
What a pity that she's dead. I would hit her if I saw her, just to see what he'd do and ask him, why didn't he help me? I mean, why didn't he stay?
In retrospect, she's able to laugh about it. Like, if I saw those people again, I don't know what I'd do. But she still didn't understand why they didn't help her, or why she had to call the ambulance herself.
Then I made phone calls for an ambulance. I couldn't think of any other number than 911. And I would ask for an ambulance so they could bring me.
She couldn't remember any number but 911.
And I would tell them the situation I found myself in, that I was in labor, and then I needed them to come get me.
She told the 911 dispatch, that she was alone, in labor, and someone needed to come get her.
They didn't arrive.
No one came. Teodora said she called again and again and again. Dispatch would answer and tell her someone was already on their way, but no one was coming.
I don't have total recollection of how many calls I made, but it was between 5 and 7, and every call I made, the operator told me that they were already on their way, but they never arrived.
She doesn't remember exactly how many times she called, but it was at least 5. All she does remember is that she was in so much pain from labor, she lost consciousness.
Sadly, my baby was born there, and unfortunately, well, I was unconscious. When they arrived, I knew my daughter was dead, and I had lost consciousness.
When she regained consciousness, she was in a pool of her own blood. She had apparently given birth, but her baby girl was dead.
From there, they accused me of having murdered my newborn.
Hours passed. The police finally arrived. But when they saw the situation, they accused Teodora of aggravated homicide.
Without any argument, without something that would determine the death of my newborn, right? Because until now, until this moment, it's not possible to determine the cause of my newborn's death.
So the fact of the matter is, we will never know the actual cause of death of Teodora's baby girl. According to a medical examiner who later analyzed the case, Teodora's baby never took her first breath. She had died before she was born. In contradiction, the state decided that it was an abortion, which caused her to be prosecuted. The only thing that we do know for sure is that no one came to help her, and the state never took responsibility for not arriving sooner.
So, from my point of view, I am innocent. But unfortunately for the Salvadoran state, I am guilty until now, till this day.
To this day, Teodora remains steadfast in her innocence. Unfortunately, she says, the Salvadoran state didn't agree and still doesn't. After declaring she was a murderer, the policeman put her in an open-air convertible vehicle, which was not covered in the back. It was raining. Police took her to the station. Wet, bloody, and in desperate need of medical attention. They kept her there for 4 hours. At one point, she remembers one police officer saying to another, "Let's take her, she's dying. Let her go to the hospital to die."
And well, then that happened on July 13th.
At 9 in the morning the next day, Teodora opened her eyes and she was surrounded by journalists and media. They all wanted to hear from the woman who was accused of killing her baby. Her family still had no idea what had happened to her. They found out by watching the midday news, along with everyone else they knew.
And then my parents are also experiencing this discrimination. My dad told me once, your uncles, your cousins made me feel bad because suddenly they saw me and the first thing they did was tell me that I had a bad daughter.
Teodora's father told her it was hard on everyone. All of a sudden, aunts, uncles, cousins, they judged them for having raised a, quote, murderer. For those labeled as bad mothers, the stigma is pervasive and loudly expressed. Back at the hospital, doctors refused to give Teodora medication for the pain. They told her they were discharging her because the bed could be taken by a woman who deserved it. Hours later, the same day, police took Teodora back to the station. They put her in a cell with many women, and police told them she killed her baby. So the women started to beat her. She was there for 8 days. Her family tried to visit and bring her food, but the police wouldn't let them see her or feed her. She says they wanted her to die. And slowly.
I had hoped that at some point we would be able to get the truth about what happened. But unfortunately, that didn't happen because everyone thinks I'm guilty, and there's nothing that I can do to change that. In other words, I'm guilty. I'm nothing. Nothing will happen to me. Nothing will happen for me. And with that comes a time when you just have to resign yourself and whatever has to happen, let it happen. And just having that faith.
Teodora would spend the next 11 years incarcerated. She was part of the first 17 women to be prosecuted for an obstetric emergency. But since 2009, at least 180 more cases have been filed.
This is Green Tide Rising. Don't go anywhere. Hi, Monica.
Hey, Asha, and welcome everyone to episode 2 of Green Tide Rising, where we get an eye-opening look at the reality of living in a country where all abortion is banned. No exceptions.
A number of US states are pushing for this right now, but as we will learn from Teodora's story, there is a way forward despite a total abortion ban. And who better to give us insight into this progress than our friend Jimena Casas Izaza, renowned feminist lawyer and sexual and reproductive rights advocate who is currently tracking the impact of abortion criminalization across Latin America and the Caribbean, looking at a decade's worth of data and stories. It's like looking into the future here in the United States if we don't take the lessons learned. And at the end of this episode, and every episode, she will share how each of us can implement the fight for reproductive freedom and bodily autonomy, creating somewhat of a blueprint for us, modeled off the success of the Green Wave movement.
So be sure to listen all the way to the end of this episode to hear Jimena's call to action.
Okay, let's get back to El Salvador.
El Salvador is a small but densely populated country in Central America. It's about the size of Massachusetts. And recently, the country has been in the news because of President Nayib Bukele's re-election.
Nayib Bukele has been sworn in as the president of El Salvador for the second time.
It used to be that the Salvadoran constitution prohibited a re-election of a president. You get one term, and that's it. You can't be president again. But over the course of his first term, Bukele took steps to control every branch of government, including the highest court in El Salvador, which allowed him to bypass a constitutional ban on consecutive terms.
Despite growing concerns for Bukele's authoritarianism, the Biden administration sent a high-level delegation to the inauguration.
This marked a shift for the Biden administration, which just 3 years prior had refused to meet with Bukele in D.C. But because of the upcoming 2024 US election and other geopolitical forces, both the Biden admin and prominent MAGA emissaries were there. Meanwhile, in D.C., protesters gathered outside the Salvadoran embassy to call out the US government.
We know that your government knows of the kidnapping and deaths of our children and families in Bukele's jails. President Biden, it shames us that your government decided to participate in the inauguration of a new dictator in El Salvador.
Right now, the Republican Party in particular has been fully embracing El Salvador's president ahead of a potential second Trump term. The former president's son, Donald Trump Jr., right-wing media firebrand Tucker Carlson, and Florida Representative Matt Gaetz all attended the inauguration. On a video posted to social media, Don Jr. congratulates the Salvadoran president, saying,
"Incredible victory, and amazing accomplishments, actually. Thanks. And you do it all without having to jail your political opponents, which I loved in the speech yesterday."
Just to be super clear, Bukele does have a history of jailing his political opponents, and what Don Jr. was trying to do was make a not-so-subtle reference to his father's criminal conviction in New York. Regardless, the interaction between the two men was kind of giddy and awkward, like they were trying to bro out over their common love for dictatorships, I don't know. But it just came off as weird.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
President El Salvador has increasingly engaged anti-democratic policies, and a number of people, including Matt Gaetz in the United States, have talked about how we need to study what's happening in El Salvador and adopt some of these policies in the U.S.
This is Jocelyn Viterna, a professor of sociology and the chair of Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies at Harvard.
Hello? Do you hear what's happening?
So it's definitely a movement of ideas between the two countries. It's not a one-way passage of information.
Donald Trump Jr.'s awkward, weird comments,
And you do it all without having to jail your political opponent.
unintentionally pointed to a much deeper irony in El Salvador's history. And full disclosure, my father fled El Salvador in the 80s, during the Civil War. Lots of my family fled from the region. My dad was only a teenager when his mother, scared for his life, forced him to leave the country. Today, Salvadorans are the third largest population of Latinos living in the United States. The diaspora is large, and part of the reason I'm here, talking to you right now, is because of this history.
We have to remember that this was the height of the Cold War, and there were real concerns about what would happen if the Soviet Union took more power in the Western Hemisphere. And so Reagan famously talked about drawing a line in the sand in El Salvador. And so after Cuba had its communist revolution,
in less than 4 years, Fidel Castro has allowed himself to become dominated by Russia. Her support now constitutes a threat to Western security.
and after Nicaragua had its communist revolution,
Nicaragua has become the first Soviet foothold on the continent of the Americas.
there was a real sense that when the revolutionary movement moved to El Salvador, that the United States wanted to stop that.
Some geographic context here. El Salvador is only a short 3-hour flight from Dallas, and that's important to know when we get into the details of why President Reagan set his sights on this tiny country in the 1980s. So let's go back to Jocelyn with the history. And here's where we begin to learn how the extreme anti-abortion rhetoric and policies in both the US and El Salvador start to intertwine and rear their ugly heads.
So from the beginning, the United States began to fund the counter-guerrilla movements in El Salvador, the counter-FMLN movements.
If we do not act promptly and decisively in defense of freedom, new Cubas will arise from the ruins of today's conflicts.
The FMLN, the Frente Farabundo Martí para la Liberación Nacional, that formed in El Salvador, was a loose coalition of 5 different militant groups, but each of those militant groups started from different kinds of community-based organizations, and within those community-based organizations, there were some intellectual movements, as well as religious movements, as well as campesino movements who were working for the right to the land and the right to healthcare and these types of things as well. And so the United States did this by dramatically expanding the size of the Salvadoran armed forces. We're talking probably 5-6 times greater. And by the end of the 1980s, the United States government was giving El Salvador, in the 1980s dollars, over $1 million a day.
That's just under $4 million in today's economy.
To fight this insurgent army that was largely comprised of poor campesinos who, many of them joined the FMLN because they wanted change, but many of them joined because the war came to their village and they could sit down and die or they could join one of the sides, and they typically tended to join the FMLN guerrilla side.
It was difficult for people to avoid being part of the war in some way or another. Heavy international funding was going to both sides. But the U.S. was funding the human rights abuses of the Salvadoran government, including death squads and widespread massacres of innocent civilians.
But I think what happened over the course of the war was that there became a real focus on painting one side as radical and the other side as righteous. And both sides were trying to do this, right?
With a research team, Jocelyn has gathered a lot of data on the opinions of activists, politicians, and regular folks with ideological perspectives on both the left and right.
And one of the things that came out of my interviews was that when people were trying to talk about why the state was so evil. They oftentimes used really gendered language. They would talk about how the situation was so bad that even women had to fight in the war. And we talk about how the state armies were so bad that they would rape the women and they would cut babies out of pregnant women's bellies. There were these kinds of very gendered notions that were oftentimes used to decide who were the good guys and who were the bad guys during the war. But I think we long have had this notion that when we talk about women and children, we're talking about sort of these righteous, apolitical understandings, even though we had a lot of women doing very gender-bending kinds of activities during the war. Women did fight as guerrillas. They did serve as commanders. They were radio operators, field doctors, and sometimes even spies. So there were a lot of ways that women became very critical to the FMLN's success and to the way the war went forward. But it was really remarkable to me when I did these interviews that the ways that these women took on non-traditional, more powerful roles was always framed as an exception to the time and not something that really happened.
In many ways, the feminist movement didn't grow as much as you'd think. But how could it? The Civil War lasted 12 years. 80,000 people died and disappeared. An estimated 1 million people were displaced during the war, many of whom fled to the United States. In 1992, peace accords ended the Civil War. They called for a final ceasefire with the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of the armed groups, and brought comprehensive reform to El Salvador. The country had to rebuild its infrastructure from scratch, including the FMLN. They had to figure out how to transform a militant organization into a political party that could run a presidential campaign in the next 2 years. But women in the FMLN did not see themselves reflected in the peace accords. They saw that their contributions were being erased. Here is Morena Herrera, FMLN militant turned feminist activist, reflecting on that moment.
When we reviewed the peace agreements, we were not there. And we said, why aren't women here? So it was in self-defense and in defense of all women that we said no. From here on out, the only fights that recognize us as a priority, that put our rights first, that was also the decision. And it was a decision that changed my life.
Morena founded the country's first feminist organization, Citizens Group for the Decriminalization of Abortion. She said that the founding of that organization, it changed her life, and it would end up saving the lives of many others. But that took years. So what happened next was somewhat unexpected. Here's Jocelyn again to explain more.
And on the conservative side, the Arena Party, they didn't have a lot to offer the poor. They didn't know what to argue in these democratic elections. So they looked at the world around them, and what was happening in the world was there was a huge debate about abortion at the time.
The year the peace accords happened, you also began to see the first anti-abortion editorials and articles appear in Salvadoran newspapers.
And so we start to see this language of abortion rights coming into El Salvador in 1994 and really taking off by the 1997 elections.
This is a fragile time for the country. Everyone in El Salvador is rebuilding, including political powers. And working with the church, the right wing began proposing that El Salvador could protect its sovereignty and the lives of unborn Salvadorans from the UN takeover by passing stronger anti-abortion legislation.
What the right-wing government proposed doing was taking the already very strict abortion laws and making them even stricter by taking away all of those exceptions and saying no abortions, no exceptions, not even when the life of the mother is at risk.
The right was able to mobilize thousands of people over a number of weekends by making announcements to parishioners during Mass. Activist Morena Herrera warned the Salvadoran government that abortion would continue to exist in El Salvador and that criminalization would not prevent women from having abortions. But by 1998, the Catholic Church's campaign to implement the total abortion ban was a success. And a year later, they were able to help pass a constitutional amendment recognizing an embryo as a human being from, quote, the moment of conception.
And it's a little bit crazy when you think about it, because typically what we see are anti-abortion laws being overturned by pro-choice laws, and then there's a backlash, and the pro-life movement comes out of a backlash. And El Salvador seems quite unique in that there was no liberalization.
But even after the anti-abortion movement got everything they wanted, the messaging was so powerful in mobilizing voters that the movement, the church, and the right wing kept wanting to fight
against the enemy of the unborn. But once all the laws were passed and the Constitution was changed, they didn't really have anyone to fight against anymore. And they really started to change their narratives towards attacking unnatural mothers who would just throw away their babies.
And while there was no evidence to support the narrative that women were throwing away their babies, those stories continued to circulate.
And I found that around the 2000s, 2001s, we start to see this real narrative coming up about what they called madres desnaturalizadas, which is like unnatural or even perverse mothers. But this notion of these bad mothers became a bit of a moral panic.
And you begin to see that panic reflected in the laws that led to the prosecution and imprisonment of vulnerable women. Between 2000 and 2011, 129 women in El Salvador were prosecuted for abortion or homicide. Most of these women were young, poor, with limited education, and from rural communities. By this time, Morena Herrera had become El Salvador's leading advocate for abortion law reform and became the director of the San Salvador Feminist Collective, who launched a campaign in 2014 to free 17 women known as Las 17.
We have 17 plus women who are sentenced to 30 and 40 years in prison.
Las 17 is a campaign amplifying the experiences of the first 17 women who were incarcerated for obstetric emergencies and sentenced to 30 to 40 years in prison. Here is Teodora Vasquez, the woman with the obstetric emergency we heard from earlier.
What do I tell you? The 17? Well, I'm one of the 17.
Teodora is one of the original 17 women.
We are women who were deprived of our liberties because of an obstetric emergency or miscarriage. When the reform of the Criminal Procedure Code changed to where life begins, to the moment of conception, many women have gone to jail for crimes they did not commit, here in El Salvador.
Teodora says that since the constitutional reforms for personhood amendments, many women like her have found themselves incarcerated through no fault of their own.
Like we mentioned earlier, Teodora would spend over a decade of her life imprisoned. She says her life for a long time was just a routine. She shared a cell with 70 women. Every day, she would wake up at 2 a.m. just to make sure she was able to shower.
Then I would go back to sleep till 5 a.m. Then they do a body count to make sure no one escaped.
Then she would go back to sleep till 5 a.m. when the guard counted the women. Teodora would then have breakfast, go to work, and do any activities she could, living out the same routine day in and day out.
From the moment you arrive in jail, that's all you do with your life while you're there.
But one day, a researcher and a team came into the jails.
So I started working with women who were incarcerated for what appeared to be obstetrical emergencies. They lost the baby that they were carrying, typically a wanted baby, and they were put in jail first for abortion and then for what they were called the aggravated homicide.
She came to visit us once. She looked at me and I looked at her, and we got along really well.
Jocelyn looked at Teodora, and Teodora looked back at Jocelyn. It was kind of an instant connection between the two that day they met in jail. Teodora likes to talk and share and laugh.
I think it was that. She quickly knew that I had a lot to say, and so we started an interview.
She says that's what made her stand out to Jocelyn. It wasn't just her sad story, though she did want to tell it. And with that, Teodora gave Jocelyn an interview.
And through the work of a lot of activists on the ground, I tried to provide some amicus briefs and scientific support. They were able to get sentences overturned and commuted, and most of the women are out of jail now. And so Teodora is one of those women.
they were able to get the sentences overturned.
She came here to El Salvador just because I had gained my freedom.
Teodora says after her release, Jocelyn even came back to see her.
My sister. She is my sister, but from a different color.
She and Jocelyn are like sisters, of different colors, but sisters nonetheless. But after Teodora was free, the realities of what life is like for a woman like her, with all the stigmas now attached to Teodora, was not what she imagined.
I said, the day I go out, the first thing I'm going to do is eat a hamburger, a pizza, some chicken.
She thought the first thing she would do was eat everything she couldn't eat while in jail.
I imagined the most exquisite dishes in the world. But the reality is that when I left, I knew I had to have money to buy a pizza.
But now that Teodora was out in the real world, you needed money to buy pizza, and you needed a job to have money. And the jobs for a woman who had spent a decade in jail for homicide were non-existent. And remember, Teodora went into jail in 2007, around the time smartphones just came into the US market. When Teodora got out and saw a phone for the first time, she says it was wild. But she got the hang of it fast, as she spent the time trying to find the other 16 women.
And then I said, well, I'm going to look for them so that they can tell me what they're doing, how they have figured it all out. Let them explain to me what they're doing so I can now replicate it.
She was trying to figure out what to do with her life now. And she hoped that she'd be able to meet a friend and get some guidance.
What happened is that when I started looking for all these women, I realized that they were all in very difficult situations.
She didn't find anyone in a good situation.
And I said, well, the truth is that you have to do something. Because the reality is that you have to be a little crazy, a little disoriented.
She says, you gotta be a little bit crazy to want to do this. She wanted these women to be okay. She herself wanted to be okay. And in fact, more than okay. They wanted decent jobs, to go to college, to receive the healthcare they never got, and to help heal from what they had just been through. So, together, they organized.
And so, it is the first women's organization in El Salvador made up of women who have been incarcerated. There is no other. It's just us, Mujeres Libres.
Mujeres Libres is the first organization in El Salvador looking to better the lives of women who have been incarcerated. It's part mutual aid fund, part a place where women can get resources and healthcare services, and it's also a house where women who have been incarcerated for obstetric emergencies can live and rebuild their lives.
After losing so many years of their lives, losing most of their possessions and everything else, losing contact with their children and trying to rebuild their lives after that, they're also doing a lot of work to try and educate themselves and then in turn educate others to make sure their stories don't repeat themselves. One of the things Mujeres Libres has asked me to do is to give them a weekly course on Zoom about human rights and gender rights and what's gender and what's sexuality and how does reproduction work and what kinds of rights do people have.
Teodora told us that they even have homework.
Right now, we have homework. And it's to find a person who doesn't know much about sexual or reproductive rights and say, look, have you heard of the word feminism?
And it's been such a remarkable experience because I can bring sort of book level knowledge, but then they're the ones that bring the knowledge of what it's like to grow up as a child in El Salvador. And there's this great meeting of minds. So when I talked to them about what my research was about, and they said, but why were people so intent on putting us in jail when there was no evidence that we'd done anything wrong? I told them my theory that it was convenient. It got them political power, and the poor women oftentimes don't have the power to fight back. And they were all very quiet and sad when they heard that. And the next week I got online, and one of the women started to say, Jocelyn, we have another example for you. And I was like, what? She said, well, there was a story in El Salvador this week. This is very tragic, but a young girl was walking home by herself, and she was assaulted, raped, and killed by men. And the government arrested the girl's mother for negligence. And so the women said, so we think this is a parallel case to our own. We think President Bukele has built his brand on fighting crime, and there's no more crime in El Salvador. And suddenly there was this horrific crime happened, and that's going to destroy his brand. So he has to change the narrative and throw the blame on a poor woman with no power to maintain his political agenda. And I just kind of like dropped the mic. It's like, my work here's done, you know.
I just want to say, I am Mujeres Libres. My name is Teodora Vasquez, and we fight for our stories to never repeat themselves again for generations to come.
Teodora's story is a reminder that in a country that completely bans abortion, the impact is felt hardest on marginalized women. But thankfully, her jail sentence was not the end of her story. And today, she gets to determine her own path forward, while also empowering many other women to do the same. And hearing Jocelyn recount the role the U.S. played in where El Salvador is today, it says too much. Unless we change the course in the U.S., we are headed for the same reality. And that's why this upcoming election is so crucial for abortion rights.
So how do we push back on extreme abortion bans? And what can everyday people like us do to have an impact, despite what politicians, the courts, legal authorities, and medical professionals are deciding on our behalf? Let's check in with our friend Jimena, the feminist human rights lawyer whose study looking at the impact of abortion criminalization is both a warning signal and a blueprint of sorts on how to fight back. So Jimena, what can we in the US specifically learn from the movements in El Salvador?
What we can learn from El Salvador is that the criminalization of abortion undermines the ability of women, girls, and pregnant people to access an essential reproductive health care services. It is also a cruel policy that must end, and hospitals should not be a revolving door to prisons, and women should not be criminalized for having an obstetric emergency, and nor for deciding if they want or not to have children and when they have to have them. We are seeing outside of El Salvador that abortion restrictions do not stop abortion from happening. Medical abortion, which are known as abortion pills, we are seeing that now are becoming more used. And we know from data that when they are taken, indicates could be very safe and successful. However, if abortion restrictions and stigma continues, the access to these services is very limited. And if you are in a vulnerable situation due to your economic status or your race, or if you are a migrant, you may not have access to the safe pills and to the reliable information. And this is where all these feminist activists and the disobedience becomes an asset, because for years they have been working with a network of healthcare providers to provide information, and that healthcare is a human right that should be guaranteed to everyone and not a privilege only for some. And until this become a reality, the need of these feminist activists and this disobedience is going to be necessary.
We know that here in the US, people from marginalized backgrounds, immigrant folks, Black and brown people, young people, queer folks, are targeted most often when it comes to abortion restrictions. This clearly mirrors what we're seeing in El Salvador, where marginalized people are the easiest targets. It's the anti-abortion playbook.
All the consequences could be exacerbated if you are in any type of those vulnerable situations. We are seeing that criminalization could happen to anyone, but it could be exacerbated when you are in poverty, or if you are an indigenous person or Afro-descendant, and you have less access to the information and less access to an adequate legal representation. And you go to this spin of the judicial system where all your rights gets violated, and you can get sentenced as the one that Teodora got in 2018 when she was sentenced to 30 years in prison after she had a stillbirth, and she was released only in 2018 after more than a decade behind bars.
So what are the most powerful aspects of Teodora's personal story that we should be paying attention to? Because, that grassroots movement, that is really powerful.
I think this solidarity is so powerful, and it really talks about the core of our movement and the importance of grassroots organizations. And when we face many challenges, we can flip the situation by generating innovative ideas, as Mujeres Libres shows. But I think no one should have to go through what Teodora went through to become an activist. Her story, as well as the story of many of the Salvadorian women known as the 17+, are stories of resistance. Mujeres Libres is an example on how they have connected with these marginalized and stigmatized populations and how they play a crucial role in supporting women who have faced incarceration due to obstetric emergencies, and how to provide a lifeline for women in the intersection of reproductive health, legal restrictions, and social stigma.
Eliminating stigma by amplifying these true stories about abortion criminalization is something we can all do and get behind, whether you have a large platform or small. Even simply by sharing content on your fave social media platform, you are doing something. Jimena, can you explain how this kind of discourse is critical to the Green Wave strategy in terms of pushing back against the political and legal status quo?
I think that is the importance of us in our movement to change that narrative and to explain the impact that it really makes having criminalized abortion and why it could happen to anyone and why it could be becoming a terrifying fact that if you have an emergency and you want to go there to doctors take care of you, not to end in a police station. So I think that's why it's so important that we have these stories, we are able to talk and to have this conversation so we can change that narrative that is only based on stereotypes and not adequate information. Trying to make sure that we have healthy families and we have a desired motherhood and we understand these stories and we try to learn a little bit more. We will see the importance of this fight and the importance of these human rights. And I think it is important that we as a society, we don't let that stigma blind us. We should strive to understand and empathize with the situations. No woman should have to face what Teodora or any of the other 38 women that were imprisoned in El Salvador for obstetric emergencies went through. Stigma affects the life of many women. And every time that we're gonna vote, this will come on the top of our head and we will look for candidates that will only support and will protect our reproductive autonomy.
Thank you for listening to Green Tide Rising. So far, we've talked about the birthplace of the movement in Argentina in episode 1 and looked at the reality of a complete abortion ban in El Salvador in this episode. In episode 3, we're changing things up a little, right, Monica?
Oh, we're about to get nasty.
Sex makes putas out of all of us. And, sex makes people really uncomfortable. I think that when people are trying to advocate for their rights, they want to appear like good, respectable citizens.
That's next time on Green Tide Rising.
This episode was produced and written by Monica Morales Garcia.
Special thanks to Jimena Casas.
Green Tide Rising is executive produced by Jess Jacobs and Leela Meadow-Connor, with associate producer Adi Biaringer.
And produced in partnership with Pod People.
Our theme music was composed by Andres Aspiri.
I'm your host, Monica Morales Garcia.
And I'm your host and executive producer, Asha Dyer.
Join us again on Green Tide Rising. And in the meantime, head over to our YouTube channel to watch and share our accompanying video series, Entonces. Link in the show notes.
You can also find us on social media and see more about this episode on our website, greentiderising.com. Subscribe and listen wherever you get your podcasts. Bye for now.
Adios.